Hi everyone, I'm Shelley and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. I'm back with another Question the Narrative video, and today's topic is the Abomination of Desolation and the Little Season. I'm really excited to share this video with you today simply because from my studies, I have found what I believe to be a connection between several Bible verses regarding the abomination of desolation, which will then lead into the little season, and how they actually, if you take these Bible verses together and then you apply them with historical accounts, we can figure out when these things happened. And yes, I believe that they are past events. I recently finished reading Seismic Shift, A Pastor's End Times Trek by Joel Rosenauer, and that is actually how I got on this rabbit trail to begin with. I'm just going to read one specific paragraph to you, and this is the one that piqued my interest on this and got me looking into these things to begin with. So on page 81, it says, moving on in Matthew 24, and I'm just interjecting here. I always do that. I start reading and then I interject things. The passages that are mentioned in the paragraph that I'm going to be reading now, we will be going over them later in this video. I'm just reading the paragraph for now, though. Okay, anyway. Moving on in Matthew 24, we find a very interesting phrase, the abomination that causes desolation. I mentioned that this discourse is also contained in Luke and Mark. It's helpful to cross-reference those verses to give further insight into Jesus' words. Luke is enormously helpful here. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Luke was likely writing to Gentile believers who may not have understood what Jesus was saying when he mentioned Daniel and the abomination that causes desolation, like Matthew's gospel does. It's so important to keep audience relevance in mind. When Jesus says, you will see the abomination of desolation, he is not talking to us you, but them you. Them there that were there then. Once we begin to see this principle, it really is a game changer. For some reason, all I needed was that reference to desolation in Luke, referring to the abomination desolation, that I just got really excited and wanted to try to figure all of these things out. Before we start getting into the verses, though, I just want to go to Got Questions. And this is a dispensationalist website, and I want to just show you what most people think is the abomination of desolation before I get into the verses that we're going to be reading today. So, what is the abomination of desolation? Jesus spoke of a coming abomination of desolation in the Olivet Discourse as he referenced a future event mentioned in Daniel 9:27. And yes, it was future to him. Yes. In Matthew 24:15-16, Jesus says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. So now I'm just going to scroll down here because it tells us that what the Futurists believe. And again, Got Questions is a Futurist website, and most evangelical Christians are Futurists and dispensationalists specifically. So let's just read that. We take the Futurist view, which sees the abomination of desolation prophecy as still future. In our view, Jesus was referring to the Antichrist, who in the end times will establish a covenant with Israel for 7 years and then break it by doing something similar to what Antiochus Epiphanes did in the temple. The sacrilegious object Jesus called the abomination of desolation could be the image of the beast that the Antichrist's right-hand man, the false prophet, will order to be set up and worshipped. Of course, for Matthew 24:15 to be yet future, the temple in Jerusalem will have to be rebuilt before the tribulation begins. So now you see where that whole idea of a third temple being rebuilt comes in, because it has to be in order for what they believe to be true. I also want to point out here, this does not have to do with the abomination of desolation, but he calls the false prophet the Antichrist's right-hand man. The false prophet is from the book of Revelation. Antichrist Never mentioned in the entire book of Revelation. So right there, they are kind of putting things into Revelation that aren't there to begin with. I just have to point that out. So with the dispensationalist idea of the abomination of desolation being a still future event, let's read some of these passages that I'm going to be addressing today. And we will start with Matthew 24. We'll read over here the context, 14 to 16. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination of desolation described by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Okay, so we have first this reference to the abomination of desolation. And this whole thing, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world to all the nations, and then the end will come. That's a topic for even another video. So I know I'll get questions about that. Hopefully at some point I will. And again, I am just sharing with you things that I have learned. I am by no means an authority on these things. I've done a lot of reading about these things. And when I am reading, I've got, the book on one side, the Bible on the other. And thankfully, the authors that I read from, they are extensively in the Word. And they will tell you specifically, go read it for yourself. And they won't even type out many times what the passages say because they want you to go into your Bible and read what it says. So I really appreciate that. And it's had me so much in the Word. Okay. So abomination of desolation, it's talking about in Matthew 24, which is what the dispensationalists think that it's a future event. Now let's go to Luke chapter 21. We're going to read verses 20 through 22. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. So first of all, I want to point out, it says these are days of vengeance. It doesn't say that at that time it will be days of vengeance. It says these are days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. To fulfill all that is written. Okay, all means all. It doesn't say some, it says to fulfill all that is written. Now, let's go back to the part where it says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart. It tells us this is supposed to happen after the abomination of desolation. This passage here only says desolation. So you might be saying, well, no, that's not talking about the abomination of desolation, but it is. The parallel verse right here is, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of. All right. So what happened in the 1st century AD? Between 66 and 70 AD, the city of Jerusalem was surrounded by the Roman armies. And what happened at that time? The Christians fled to Pella. They fled Judea. This is actually a really interesting article on adammarshall.com. So I will leave a link for this in the description box, and anything that I use here, including the book by Joel. But I'm just using this specifically for Eusebius's historical account of what happened when the believing Jews or the Christians fled Judea. It says, but the people of the church in Jerusalem had been commanded by a revelation vouchsafed to approved men there before the war to leave the city and to dwell in a certain town of Perea called Pella. And when those that believed in Christ had come there from Jerusalem, then, as if the royal city of the Jews and the whole land of Judea were entirely destitute of holy men, the judgment of God at length overtook those who had committed such outrages against Christ and his apostles, and totally destroyed that generation of impious men. So the Christians fled Judea, went to Pella. After that, Jerusalem was completely destroyed. Totally destroyed. So if you're following along, we have historical accounts of exactly what is spoken of here happening. Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. The Christians, they had a revelation that it was time to leave Judea because they knew that its desolation had come near. And what happened after the Christians left and fled Judea? The entire city was razed. It was burned. So even when you're just looking at it from that angle, I have a really hard time understanding how people can look at it as a still future event when it specifically tells us right here in the Gospels what is going to happen when the believers are supposed to flee. And then we have historical accounts matching that. That is exactly what happened. And we certainly know what happened with the destruction of Jerusalem. And yet people will still reach and say the abomination of desolation has not happened yet. But this goes even further because if you remember, I also entitled this video, The Abomination of Desolation and the Little Season. So let's go to Revelation 20. So many people look at Revelation 20 as being yet another set of events. And I look at it as being just like the rest of the book of Revelation. It is a recapitulation of events that were already written about in the rest of, I'm not even going to say just the New Testament, in the Old Testament and the New Testament. It is a recapitulation. Revelation 20 is not anything new. It's not a new set of events. So if we read Revelation 29, in light of what we have read today regarding the abomination of desolations and the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem and the saints then fleeing Judea, let's read what Revelation 20 verse 9 says. And they went up over the breadth of the earth and compassed the camp of the saints about and the beloved city, and fire came down out of heaven and devoured them. So I particularly like the Berean Study Bible because rather than compassed, it's hard to understand. A lot of times it will say encircled. This says surrounded. Okay? What did the Roman army do in the accounts that we just read? Surrounded Jerusalem. So, and they, in my opinion, they is the Roman army, marched across the broad expanse of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. The Roman army surrounded Jerusalem where the saints still were at that time. And they were in the beloved city, which at that point was Jerusalem. And then they fled. And then after they fled, fire came down from heaven and consumed them. What happened to Jerusalem after the Christians fled to Pella? It was destroyed. It was ablaze. So, now let's look at this in terms of the little season. I'm not going to read the whole passage because I've read it so many times in my videos, and I'm sure that most of you who are watching are very, very familiar with this passage. So I'm only going to read the really relevant portions that have to do with what I'm talking about here. So it tells us, I'll just start with verse 3. And through him, and this means Satan, or the dragon, and threw him into the pit, and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. Now, I have to say that must certainly makes it sound like this was God's will for him to be released. And I believe that his will was so that he could then begin so that the Lord could use the dragon in his judgment against Jerusalem, because he does in fact use other armies, other nations, sometimes other forces to what's the word I'm looking for? To judge other nations. It's not particularly the word I was looking for, but you get my drift. So Satan will be released for a little while. That's where the term short season comes from. I've really only ever seen short season in maybe one translation, so I don't know why that one caught on so much. Little season I see more often, but I see little while the most. But it really doesn't. It doesn't matter. Actually, it does matter, because it can be very confusing for people because they will see season in some of the versions and then they will equate it to, a year. Well, there are 4 seasons in a year. So if it's 1,000 years, then that means that the season is a quarter of it. And I used to do this, and I used to say, okay, well, the season has to be then, 250 years. I know I'm like going on a tangent here, but this is something that I really need to point out when it comes to using the terms little season or little while. It really does matter. So before I even get to the rest of this, let's go, just bear with me. Go to Revelation 23. And I usually like to use Bible Hub because we can look up the Greek for it. So, what do they use? Do they use the word season? After that, he must be released for a brief period of time. So, it's chronon. It does not mean season. It actually means a space of time or interval. An individual opportunity, by implication, delay. So it's a period of time, and it's for a brief period of time. Micron, little, small. So it's for a little period of time. Okay? So season can be a little bit misleading, in my opinion. Now, so Satan is released. That's where we get that term from. And we will start reading here. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. In my opinion, Gog and Magog is the war between Jerusalem and Rome. And when it is saying they marched up over the broad plain of the earth, it is the Roman army. They surrounded the camp of the saints in Jerusalem. Then after they fled, fire came down from heaven and consumed them. Imagine what Jerusalem looked like at the time that all of these things were happening. The entire city was destroyed. It was burned. You could certainly say that fire rained down. So, in my humble opinion, I believe that that is specifically when the Abomination of Desolation and, in fact, the little season happened. Because if we look, these things happened during the time that Satan was released. It was during the time of the little season that these things happened. So if the Abomination of Desolation and the surrounding of Jerusalem or the camp of the saints happened during the little season, then that also means that the little season happened in the 1st century. That's all that I have for you today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave one down below. And if you like my work and would like to support my channel, I will leave a link in the description box for my YouTube membership, or you can just click on it right on my channel page. And I hope you have a great day.